are not for profit, owned by their members. They're cooperatives, not corporations. And so they do not pay federal corporate income tax. But what I'll share with you as well is if you look at the state statute, it does not, the current state statute does not care whether you pay taxes or not. If it did, if it cared whether you paid federal corporate income tax, there's 52 banks in Nebraska that are subchapter S banks. They don't pay federal corporate income tax. So you have 52 credit unions that don't pay federal, or 52 banks that don't pay federal corporate income tax, and you have 56 credit unions that don't pay federal corporate income tax. So I think with regards to this bill, I think if you look at the state taxes, credit unions pay the real property tax. And I think most Nebraskans would say that's a pretty high amount of money that they pay into the coffers of the state.
And then just, thank you, I appreciate that. That does sort of synthesize that, I think, really well. And then one other complaint I think that I've heard in my emails that I just would ask you to address, or concern rather, is that banks obviously, as Senator Jacobson often reminds us, have a lot of scrutiny and a lot of oversight. Credit unions, could you, I guess, give us a little bit of details as to some of the oversight that they have as well to ensure that the money from the public would be safe in that respect?
Yeah, credit unions, much like banks, banking institutions, financial institutions generally have very heavy regulations to make sure consumers are protected. So when it comes to credit unions in Nebraska, we are overseen, if you were state chartered, you are overseen, or regulated, I should say, by the Nebraska Department of Banking and Finance, which you all are very familiar with, Director Lammers and his staff, and what a great job they do. But in addition to that, credit unions are also regulated by the National Credit Union Administration, which is the prudential regulator at the federal level for credit unions. Every credit union in the state must be federally insured, and the national regulator, the NCUA, oversees that insurance fund. And so every credit union in Nebraska is regulated by the NCUA. And then, of course, our state charters are also regulated by the Nebraska Department of Banking and Finance.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Senator Duncan. Senator Jacobson.
I'd like to follow up kind of on the line of taxation, but before that, I'd just like to ask, are political subdivisions allowed to be members of a credit union?
With this bill, they would not be voting members.
So they wouldn't be a member. They're not a member today, and they wouldn't be a member.
Correct.
Why not?
The legislation says as a mutual financial institution, they cannot be a member as in a voting member. They can deposit there. They can obviously get their money back. They can earn interest, but they would not be a voting member, which is traditional in a credit union for individuals.
I'm going to circle back to that after you've answered the following questions. First of all, I'm going to speaking strictly to federal credit unions.
Okay.
Do federal credit unions pay any federal income taxes?
Just like subchapter S banks, they do not.
Do federal credit unions pay state income tax?
Just like banks and credit unions, they do not.
I'm going to zero back on the banks. I just want to answer because I'm going to explain the sub S issue, but the answer is no, correct? Okay, are federal credit unions subject to the deposit tax? The banks are.
They are not.
Do federal credit unions pay occupation taxes?
I'd have to get back to you on that.
The answer is no. Do federal credit unions pay sales tax?
In some cases, they probably would, but they don't have to.
They don't.
They don't have to.
All right. Are federal credit unions subject to something referred to that banks are subject to, which is the Community Reinvestment Act?
They are not, but the CRA is from 1977, and that was because of redlining.
So
it's not. I know those on the opposition side would say, "Well, we're subject to CRA."
I'll accept that as a
but
no.
if you look at CRA, it's not a badge of honor.
You've answered my question.
All
You
right.
answered my question on that. Okay. My other question then would be this. You referred to the comparison to sub-S banks, which is a red herring. Okay. We know that sub-S banks, when they're organized that way, there's K1s that are passed through to the members, to the owners of the banks, and they do pay federal and state income taxes, correct?
Correct. Same with credit union members.
All right. So do credit unions pay taxes on undistributed income?
No,
They don't. Do credit unions routinely make dividends to their members?
Yes.
Dividends.
Dividends, yes.
Credit unions generally
I get
make
dividends every year.
every year equal to their earnings.
Well, I mean, when you have earnings, they give some of those funds back in lower fees and things like that.
Isn't it true that banks pass through a K-1 100% of their earnings to their members, or to their owners, and they pay 100 taxes on 100% of that distribution?
Senator, I won't know. I mean,
Distributed
I did own a sub-S gym, and I did not take all the profits and get a K-1.
Okay, all right. I guess one thing, I guess the last thing I'd come back to is, why is it that credit unions are not subject to all these taxes?
Because credit unions are not corporations, they're cooperatives. They're member-owned financial institutions. There's two ways in which you could structure as a financial institution: for-profit, not-for-profit. If it's beneficial and you're a business person and you look at, no matter what business it is, and say, I can be a not-for-profit gym or I can be a for-profit gym, you're going to make the determination whether you want to go the nonprofit way or the for-profit way, depending on the advantages and what you want to get out of it. I think the same thing goes with financial institutions. You have not-for-profit credit unions and for-profit banks. Both make the decision, I want to operate as a not-for-profit credit union where all my members are the owners of the institution. Or if you're a bank, you may say, I'd like to own this bank for myself and I'd like to take the profits. And there's nothing wrong with that. They're both equally good structures. It's just a matter of what's your choice and what do you choose. That's really what it comes down to. And the federal tax stuff, that's a red herring. I mean, this is about monies coming into local political subdivisions here in Nebraska from Nebraska. And credit unions, every credit union pays property tax, which those reports tell you is the majority of taxes that local political subdivisions receive.
One last question, I guess. My understanding is that credit unions were formed to serve people of modest means. And there are several different types of credit unions. There are credit unions that are community credit unions. There are credit unions that are really by a specific class. So how do we deal with that with this legislation?
You won't deal with that in this legislation. Frankly, I guess my answer to that would be credit unions do, as you say, they can have various fields of membership. So they can be a community charter. They could serve Lancaster County. We have credit unions that serve associations. We have credit unions that serve employers, Union Pacific Railroad. So there are many ways in which credit unions serve their members, and having a community charter isn't always the best choice for credit unions. Many credit unions do very well with their field of membership, and it might be an employer-based credit union. It might be multiple SEG, that's multiple employers or segments of the population. And some thrive with a community charter. But this legislation would not touch the field of membership, sir.
And I'm not saying it does. I guess I'm just asking if you are a credit union, UP credit union, for example, and yet you would be taking deposits from non-members and outside of that field of membership, correct? Under this legislation.
Potentially could. I don't foresee that happening, but I suppose that could potentially
But the legislation doesn't prohibit that you're
No.
proposing.
No, it
All right,
wouldn't.
thank you.
Thank you, Senator Jacobson. Additional committee questions? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, additional proponents for LB 483. All right, opponent testimony for LB 483. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chairman Slama, members of the Banking, Commerce, and Insurance Committee. My name is Bob Holstrom, Hallstrom. I appear before you today as registered lobbyist for the Nebraska Bankers Association in opposition to LB 483. The legislation attempts to piggyback onto existing law authorizing mutual savings and loans to accept the deposit of state and local political subdivision funds. And while the credit unions today are seeking similar treatment to that accorded to the mutual savings and loans, there's a significant distinction to be drawn. At one time, mutual savings and loans were like credit unions, not subject to most of the taxes that are paid by other financial institutions. But at some point in time, they became so much bank-like that the federal law was changed and they were subjected to the panoply of taxes that traditional banks pay. Savings and loans pay federal and state income taxes. Federally chartered credit unions do not. In addition, in order for the credit unions to be eligible to accept public deposits under LB 483, they must go against the very grain of what they stand for in terms of being member-owned and member-driven. Specifically, there's a state constitutional provision that precludes the state or local political subdivisions from having an ownership interest in a private corporation. So when the change was made for mutual financial savings and loans, once they started paying taxes, they did provide an out to amend their bylaws and charters to specifically eliminate some of the vestiges of ownership that would otherwise apply to a member. And that is exactly what this bill would allow for credit unions. And we would submit that to the extent that the credit unions are not paying their fair share of taxes into the public coffers, that they should not feed from the public trough. Senator Jacobson referenced the Community Reinvestment Act. That is something that is very significant in terms of local investments, particularly in low and moderate income neighborhoods. Banks are subject to that. Credit unions are not. The final thing that I would note is that these public funds serve a particular significance for community banks in terms of a source of liquidity to make loans to small businesses, beginning farmers, first-time homeowners, and so forth. And if we take away some of these public funds by allowing tax-exempt advantage credit unions to have access to those funds, we will harm the ability of community banks to fully serve their communities. I think Senator Jacobson has honed in on the S corporation issue that Mr. Lukenhaus addressed. It's clear that banks do transfer through a Schedule K-1 their full income, whether it's distributed or not. Credit unions historically have retained those earnings, not passing them through necessarily in the form of dividends to their customers, and therefore those retained earnings are not taxed until and unless they are distributed. And when you see particularly federally chartered credit unions having naming rights on large football stadiums and basketball stadiums and building large buildings, that becomes retained earnings rather than distributed. For those reasons, we oppose the bill. I'd be happy to address any questions of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Hallstrom. Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Okay. Additional opponent testimony, LB 483. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Dexter Schrodt, DEXTER-SCHRODT. I am President and CEO of the Nebraska Independent Community Bankers Association. I'm here to testify in opposition of LB 483. Real quick, I just want to touch on community banks in general. I know my bankers are honored to hold these public funds that come into their trust, and they, as a community bank, work to put those funds back into the community, whether that be through lending either to small businesses or to consumers. Maybe the family that just moved in needs a new SUV to get all their kids to baseball, that sort of thing. So I just want to kind of refocus that community banks are there to serve their communities. And that's why we do feel that public funds belong with community banks. Real quick, just to clear the air on some things, and for the record, I know there was a lot of back and forth, and I don't really have much more to add than the back and forth and then what Mr. Hallstrom added. It is correct that political subdivisions would not be members of credit unions under this bill, since they have to be membership based. And I think that should just give us all a pause just to consider why they would want those funds then, if it's not coming from their membership and they're not allowed to be members. And there was talk on the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, and Senator Duncan, I appreciate you on the regulation of credit unions. And Mr. Lutenhouse said that most of the regulation pertained to consumer protection, but the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, as Mr. Hallstrom explained, requires banks to put lending back into the community, extend credit to the community. So if these public funds go into the credit unions, there's no guarantee that those funds would go back into the community in the form of lending credit. And we heard it, Mr. Lutenhouse said that they put it back in a lower cost for their members or the retained earnings that Mr. Hallstrom mentioned. That's what would be happening with the public funds, not community lending as banks are required to do. So that's why we bring up the Community Reinvestment Act. And then finally, I would just address that NACO said they wanted options for public entities, but there is no banking desert in Nebraska. We're actually one of the strongest community banking states in the country. And it's something that we should be proud of. And I'll end on that.
Thank you, Mr. Schroet. Are there any questions from the committee? Senator Kauth?
Thank you, Chair Salama. Mr. Schroet, so clearly both sides would like to have this chunk of money. Can you tell me what size of dollars are we talking about? What is actually being discussed?
That's a very good question, Senator Kauth.
so.
And that's something I might say that too. I would, and Senator Jacobson might be able to scale up what he has in his bank, but I would assume it would be in close to billions. I would assume. Don't quote me on that, but I'll get back to you.
Thank you, I'd appreciate that.
Thank you, Senator Kauth. Senator Dungan?
Thank you, Chair Salama. And you may not know the answer to this. I'm quickly trying to Google it because I genuinely don't know. How many other states allow credit unions to act in this way?
That I do not know. I'm sorry, Senator.
I can look it up later. My Google machine was too slow.
That'll happen.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Dungan. That is one thing we can all agree on in this hearing. Additional committee questions? Senator Bostar.
Thank you, Chair Sloan. Thank you, Mr. Schroet. You talked about how the focus that community banks have on serving a community is a reason why the community public funds should remain with community banks. Do you have any problem with those public funds being housed in large, non-community focused banks?
I can't really speak to that because all my members are community-focused banks.
Well, I know they are, but so on behalf of your members,
Mhm.
do you think that these public funds should be in the accounts of your members, or should it be spread across also large national banks as well?
Would I rather see public fund deposits in my community bank members as opposed to a Wells Fargo? Yes.
One last question, and it's only tangentially related to the bill in front of us. What are in broad strokes, the different sort of platform positions between the organization you represent and the Nebraska Bankers Association?
Well, a lot of our members are the same. My members, however, are solely focused community banks, Nebraska-based banks. And again, there's a lot of overlap between the membership.
And I'm curious. I mean,
Mhm.
I don't know the last time that I saw that there was a difference within a hearing where the organization and the NBA were on different sides. And I'm just curious, when is that difference manifested in the policy decisions that we make here?
As far as the state level is concerned, I don't foresee many differences occurring between my organization, the NBA. Where the differences arise are often at the federal level.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Bostar. Additional committee questions? Senator Jacobson.
I just have a couple questions, and thank you for your testimony today. First of all, maybe you don't know the answer to this question, but I'll ask it anyhow. I know in kind of a follow-up to Senator Bostar. There are several very large credit unions in Nebraska, primarily federal credit unions, and most of those are domiciled in Omaha as their headquarters. Can you give us an idea of how big they are in relationship to your members?
I actually do not know that information, Senator. I apologize.
I would think it's safe to say that they are many, many times bigger than the majority of your members in terms of total assets that they control. The other question was raised again about CRA, a Community Reinvestment Act. And we were told earlier that this had to do with redlining. As you look at your members across the state of Nebraska, particularly the rural members, do you see any reason why any of them would redline?
I wouldn't think so, especially considering it's against federal law. I would certainly hope not, but yeah, redlining historically was more in the urban areas than the rural areas, Senator.
And that's what I'm getting at, is even prior to any of that federal regulation that came down, that credit unions were able to skirt, we were still dealing with small community banks in rural areas that were in the same areas where credit unions were located. And yet those small community banks are subject to CRA, which requires not only certain lending that has to occur, but certain investments that have to be included as well, plus additional examinations. Is that correct?
That is correct. And the cost on the community banks is considerably out of proportion compared to the larger national banks. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Jacobson. Additional questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Stroh. Right, additional opponents for LB 483. Seeing none, we'll now move to neutral testimony for LB 483. All right, seeing none, that'll bring to a close our hearing on LB 483. For the record, we had letters for the record, the number of which I'm finding now. We had 6 opponent letters for LB 483 and 1 proponent. So closing out LB 483, we'll now open our hearing on LB 640. Senator Kauth.
Good afternoon, Banking
Good
Committee.
afternoon.
My name is Kathleen Kauth, Kathleen. I was asked to introduce LB 640 by the health insurance members of the Nebraska Insurance Federation. This legislation, which is based upon legislation passed in both Colorado and Nevada, would simply require hospital-owned clinics and facilities that are not on the main campus of the hospital to obtain their own National Provider Identifier, which is more simply known as an NPI. The NPI is utilized in claims for reimbursement or payment for healthcare services to identify the location of where the service is provided. This simple measure provides some level of transparency to where the service was provided to the payer of the healthcare service, whether or not the payer is an individual, employer, or an insurer. Such transparency is important because service provided at an actual hospital is reimbursed at higher rates than those services provided at off-campus because of all the critical acute care services available at the hospital. However, when such service is provided at an off-campus physician's clinic, which do not have such critical acute services available, the reimbursement rates are lower. By requiring separate NPIs, transparency and accurate reimbursement are encouraged. Further, the transparency will assist independent physician practices who are not part of the hospital systems remain competitive. Independent physician practices cannot charge hospital facility fees or hospital rates like their hospital-owned competitors. This issue is one that has been tackled by both parties in Washington, with both President Obama and President Trump targeting reforms in site-related transparency and reimbursement in the Medicare MedPAC, the Bipartisan Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, which advises Congress on Medicare payment issues, also is encouraging reform for site-related reimbursement. This is a simple act of transparency. So basically, if you have a big hospital, you get to charge higher rates, and then each little clinic owned by the big hospital is charging those higher rates. They have one NPI number. By each having its own NPI number, you'd have more accurate reflection of what the actual costs are, which should bring down the costs that insurers and ultimately consumers pay. So, thank you.
All right, thank you, Senator Kauth. Are there any questions from the committee? Senator Jacobson.
Thank you, Chair Slama. Senator Kauth, I'm just curious. So who are you bringing this bill on behalf of?
The Insurance Federation.
Okay, that's why they're sitting in the front row. Okay,
That's right.
I'll save the rest
And
of my
they
questions.
have lots of information. that you
I'll
do.
save the rest of my questions for them.
Thank you, Senator Jacobson. Additional questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you, Senator Kauth. Proponent testimony on LB 640. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Slama and members of the Banking, Commerce, and Insurance Committee. My name is Jeremiah Blakey, spelled Jeremiah, B as in boy, Lake. I'm the Government Affairs Associate and Registered Lobbyist for Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Nebraska, and I'm testifying in support of LB 640. I want to thank Senator Kauth for her vision and her leadership on this issue. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Nebraska is a member-owned mutual health insurance company that has been serving Nebraskans for nearly 85 years. We are not a publicly traded company beholden to shareholders. Our mission has always been to to provide Nebraska families with healthcare coverage at an affordable price. As healthcare costs continue to skyrocket, it is more important than ever that we advocate on our members' behalf. According to Forbes, Nebraska ranked as the sixth most expensive state for healthcare in 2020. These rising costs are on an unsustainable path and is a growing concern for many Nebraska families. This committee has taken a number of steps in the past to increase patient access without increasing healthcare costs. LB 640 builds on these efforts. As Senator Kauth said, very simply, this bill clarifies that hospitals should charge hospital prices and clinics should charge clinic prices. Unfortunately, we're seeing a national trend of provider consolidation in the hospital setting that's driving up healthcare costs. In 2021, nearly 70% of physician practices were owned by hospitals, health systems, private equity firms, or other corporate entities. That's a 12% increase in just over 2 years. When hospitals and health systems acquire private practices, the prices they charge grows by an average of 14%. LB 640 would help prevent these artificial price increases by requiring hospital-affiliated clinics to use a unique National Provider Identification number that is separate from the hospital. Simply put, this bill clarifies that the cost of healthcare is determined by the service and the site of care, not the type of entity that owns the facility. Blue Cross believes this is a common sense approach to controlling healthcare costs for Nebraska families in a transparent and meaningful way. For these reasons, I would encourage you to advance LB 640 to general file.
Thank you, Mr. Blakey. Are there any questions from the committee? Senator Jacobson.
I think a quick one. I appreciate your testimony today. I think I'm piecing together where the competing interests are right now, judging by who I think the opposing view will come from.
Yes.
And you know, full disclosure, I do serve on a hospital board, and I wrestle with these issues because I hear what you're saying.
Yep.
But yet I get concerned about do we have a situation where without the hospital facilities, do we have the clinics even viable? And I think from living in rural Nebraska, that really becomes a concern of mine in terms of how can we provide affordable care, and yet how can we provide the kinds of care that we need in terms of ERs that offer in many cases free services because there are people that can't pay, don't pay. So there's a number of unprofitable parts of a hospital, and consequently they have to pass charges on to other places. I get it with Blue Cross and Blue Shield. Thank God you guys exist because hospitals certainly don't make it with Medicare and Medicaid.
Right.
So I appreciate the dilemma. I'm just wrestling with the idea that, as I understand this, there's a requirement that there would have to be a separate ID number. Is that correct?
Correct. Correct.
And would they be required to charge different or could they charge the same price?
That helps us identify who's actually delivering the service at which site of care. And that's how you would determine what the reimbursement rate is.
And would you, as an insurance provider, be able to deny insurance as a preferred provider to those clinics that maybe don't lower their rates?
No, I think that would become an issue of the contract negotiation. So I don't think it becomes an issue of whether or not a service is covered and reimbursable. It becomes an issue of what that reimbursement rate is.
Gotcha.
But if I could, I certainly appreciate and share your concern about the sustainability of rural healthcare. Again, we have members that live all across the state, and so we want to make sure they have access to adequate healthcare services.
And I
as well.
couldn't agree with you more. I don't question that at all.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that. And I think you have, Mr. Bell is going to follow you, and then I'm waiting to see what the next testifier has to talk about.
I
as
can
well.
probably guess for you.
I do too, and I'll have some additional questions at that time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Jacobson. Additional questions from the committee. Senator Von Gilleren.
Yeah, Mr. Blakey, thank you for your testimony.
Yeah.
I just would ask you to expound just a little bit upon Senator Jacobson's questions about contract negotiation and reimbursement rates. And we know that in the scenario I'm most familiar with, being in Metro Omaha, is UNMC and the remote clinics. And of course, Methodist has remote clinics and Creighton has remote clinics. So everybody does. But there's a mothership, for lack of a better term, that houses HR administration and research and everything else. And none of those remote clinics would survive without those. So
Correct.
I'm just wondering if you can affirm or deny, I hate that, that's a bad way to say it. Can you confirm for me that as those rates are being negotiated, that those allocations certainly must be taken into account? That those clinics cannot exist on their own without the mothership
Sure.
to support them?
Yeah, to be clear, we're not trying to draw a bright line or prohibit provider consolidation. All we're saying is that when that happens, we want to know where the service is provided, because again, that helps us determine what the reimbursement rate should be. We go through this process of negotiation with the hospitals, the provider, the clinics, the physicians. So we understand how to do this. What we're looking for is transparency on the payment side to understand where that care was provided.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Senator Von Gillard. Senator Ballard.
Thank you, Chair Sloan. One of your main points in your testimony was cost savings.
Yes.
Can you help me? I know if it's going to vary, it's probably hard to quantify. Can you kind of help me wrap my head around how much this would save for?
I can give you a couple of national figures. So again, if what I referenced in my testimony is that 14% increase in prices when a hospital, or I don't know how to phrase, let me just read it to you. 12% increase when clinics are acquired by hospitals or private equity firms, okay? When you extrapolate that out, actually we being the Blue Cross Association did a study at the national level to extrapolate this out. And what that study found is it would save commercial insurance plans about $117 billion over 10 years. Now that's national, that's not Nebraska specific, but it's a big number.
That's big. And then how many hospitals would this impact? I know that's probably a tough number to.
Yeah, I can't answer that question. Again, I will just say generally, this isn't a major problem in Nebraska yet. It does happen, but I wouldn't consider it a major issue. I think with this legislation, we can get in front of the curve and again, make sure that we have that transparency on reimbursement rates going forward.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Ballard. Senator Jacobson.
I have one more question.
Sure.
I'll be brief.
Sounds
Very
good.
well. When we define off-campus, what is the definition of off-campus?
So it defines it in the legislation, but generally you're talking about a hospital-owned clinic that is more than 250 yards from the hospital.
Okay, so I'm just looking right now in North Platte, for example. We have a hospital facility, the hospital tower. They own property across the street, and it goes 2 blocks to the west. There's just as a point of reference, there's a large bank building sitting there on that corner, Robinson's corner, and they're going to be building a new facility there. So what you're telling me is each of those facilities, which would be part of the hospital, not acquired, but they would be building on and expanding, that they would have to have separate numbers and charge separately potentially?
If it's more than 250 yards, I believe so, yeah.
Okay, and that's in this bill, the 250
Correct.
yards. So that
Correct.
could be changed.
Correct.
Gotcha. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Jacobson. Additional committee questions? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Blakey.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Slama and members of the Banking, Commerce, and Insurance Committee. My name is Robert N. Bell. Last name is spelled B-E-L-L. I'm the Executive Director and Registered Lobbyist for the Nebraska Insurance Federation, the State Trade Association of Insurance Companies, both mutual and stock-owned insurance companies. I am here today to testify in support of LB 640. And thank you to Senator Kauth for introducing LB 640 on the behalf of the Federation. As you've already heard, LB 640 would require hospital-owned facilities that are not on campus of the main hospital facility to obtain a National Provider Identifier, NPI. The NPI is one of the pieces of information utilized when a claim for reimbursement or payment for health services is sent to the payer, such as a health insurer. Utilizing separate NPIs allow the payer to better identify where the particular service was provided. While, as Mr. Blakey mentioned, this is currently not a large issue in Nebraska, it could be an issue in the future as health provider consolidation continues to occur. Services provided at a hospital are notably more expensive to provide, and for good reason. Hospitals are able to provide access to comprehensive, high-quality acute care if needed. Off-site facilities such as urgent care clinics or ambulatory surgery facilities do not, by their nature, provide access to such comprehensive care. Use of unique NPIs for facilities permit payers to pay for service based upon the service provided and the location of the service, as opposed to merely who owns the facility. In the healthcare policy world, this is called site-neutral payments. While LB 640 would only address Nebraska, site neutrality is a national issue. Federal lawmakers and federal agencies are looking towards site-neutral payments as a way to control runaway spending in healthcare, particularly in the Medicare spending space. MedPAC, the bipartisan organization that advises Congress on Medicare spending issues, and the Congressional Budget Office both suggest that site-neutral payments could save billions of federal taxpayer dollars annually. However, LB 640 does not go that far, as those studies would suggest. It just requires hospitals to be transparent on where the service was provided. The Nebraska Insurance Federation believes this is a simple step in the correct direction and would urge the committee's support. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Bell. Are there any questions from the committee? Senator Bostar.
Thank you, Chair Sloan. Thank you, Mr. Bell.
You're welcome.
We received a letter from the Nebraska Rural Health Association opposing the legislation and talking about how this would increase administrative duties on sort of rural health providers. Do you have and they make recommendations of what funding should be used for instead of regulatory burdens, as I think it's referred.
Okay.
Do you
Certainly.
I
I have not seen that letter, but
obviously we're concerned about rural health access. And
We are.
We certainly don't want to imperil its availability to the folks of Nebraska.
Of course not. Now, there is going to be the burden of getting the additional NPI for off-campus facility. And then it will be necessary for the system to track where that service is provided and provide the accurate statement of what NPI applies to what claim for reimbursement. I don't doubt that is more difficult than just putting on the NPI for the main hospital facility. But we believe there would be savings overall for the payers, all the payers of healthcare on that. And would that come at a certain, I believe, minor cost to facilities? Perhaps. I can't deny that it will be just a tad bit more burdensome. I don't know. I have not filed one of these claims before in my life where I have not asked for an MPI number. So I don't know how difficult that might be. I understand it is not terribly difficult, but.
So there is, though, an argument to be made that I'm hearing that some regulatory burdens are worth it for the greater good.
Well, we have an entire code of regulatory burdens that we gladly accept and sometimes bring to you. For instance, we believe
It
there
doesn't
should
sound
be.
like you're answering the question.
There are certain consumer protections that are needed for pet insurance that are sitting on a select file that need to pass this legislative session. So,
Big issues.
yeah. And, we don't involve veterinarians in our NPI numbers either. So that's.
Thank you for answering some of my questions. And,
You're welcome.
I'll yield the remainder of my time back to the chair.
You're trying to kill me. Thank you, Senator Bostar. Additional committee questions? See none. Thank you, Mr. Bell.
You're welcome.
Okay, any proponent testimony for LB 640? See none. Opponent testimony for LB 640. Good afternoon, Mr. Hale.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Slama, members of the Banking, Commerce, and Insurance Committee. My name is Andy Hale, A-N-D-Y-H-A-L-E. I am a registered lobbyist, and I am Vice President of Advocacy for the Nebraska Hospital Association, and I'm here in opposition to LB 640. Our hospitals have increased the availability of services they provide by growing the number of hospital outpatients departments located off of main campuses. This has resulted into greater access to care and a more streamlined approach to overall health care. Because these locations typically bill insurance using systems that are fully integrated with the main hospital, payers have argued that they are unable to determine the exact location of services. Our hospitals do not need additional administrative burdens, especially at a time when staffing shortages and their expenses are at an all-time high. Our hospitals do not have the financial capabilities to hire more people and prove unnecessary, and are trying to push back against these mandates, as noted earlier, especially in our rural areas. Right now, our focus is on retaining and hiring and training medical professionals, not necessarily those that are going to be involved in processing claims. Right now, we spend a tremendous amount of time on prior authorizations, and we don't need any more hoops to jump through that may cause delays in patient care. I believe Mr. Blakey mentioned that Colorado, or I believe it was Senator Kauth mentioned that Colorado passed similar legislation in 2018. I spoke to my associate at the Colorado Hospital Association, and they described it as a nightmare. They described how the administrative burden of implementing the change, especially upfront, caused delays in services, particularly in the rural areas of the state. And they've had issues with overall payer claims with the database, that it can no longer distinguish between services that are provided off campus or independent practices. And it's just been a mess, to quote them. Adding additional regulations to hospitals requires careful consideration and balancing all of the interests involved. Essentially, this is telehealth payment parity. This is what they've done, what the insurance companies have done. They've essentially picked us apart. And so they are now going after and attempting to differentiate between the clinics and the hospitals so that they can charge a different rate for reimbursement. It's exactly why Senator Brewer's introduced LB 256. That was, I believe, February 13th before this committee. And you heard both proponent testifiers, that this is not a problem in the state. We are already heavily burdened with regulations. I know we join other industries that come before this committee. This right now is one we just don't need. So I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hale. Are there any questions from the committee?
Sure.
Senator Von Giller?
Beat you to the punch. Previous testifier could not really tell us what the process was or how burdensome it might be to get a separate NPI. Can you share briefly with us what that looks like?
It is time consuming. The amount of time, it really depends on the facility, depends on the manpower. To be quite honest, especially with the smallest of our critical access hospitals, they have individuals wearing several hats. And oftentimes there are individuals that are taken off the line that are providing care that they have to pull back in to back offices to do administrative tasks such as this. This would be a case where they're pulling people away from other things to do. Given an exact time amount, I'm not sure what that would be, but I know we do have another bill before this committee down the road dealing with prior authorizations. That is just another hoop that they have to jump through in dealing with it.
I think clearly two very different things. This would be this appears to me at least to be a one-time effort. It would be like registering with the Secretary of State for a new business or something along those lines. So I think those are clearly two different activities. Just another quick question. Should the bill move forward, I don't see anything regarding enactment that would make it any different than a normal bill. So it would take place within this next calendar year, obviously after the end of the session. But is that a cumbersome time frame? Would it, if the bill were to move forward, would a protracted enactment time be beneficial?
Yeah, I think the more time that we could get if to have to implement this with any rules and regulations that are imposed, the better.
I would ask if you could to maybe share with the committee, obviously offline, what exactly the process is to obtain an NPI. If you could do that, that'd be appreciated.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Von Gilleren. Senator Jacobson.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hale. Let me double back on some other questions. I asked the question earlier, Mr. Blakey, on off-campus. That seems to give me quite a bit of indigestion. Where would you see that, just that piece alone fitting in here if you were going to define off-campus?
Well, the way they have it defined now, I believe it's 250 yards from that facility. When we talked to some of our members, they had concerns knowing that the facility that you're referencing in North Platte, where does that begin and end? Is it the end of the property line? How do you define that? I think, I don't know where I would like to know where they came up with this number of 250 yards. How did they define that or come up with that definition?
Well, the follow-up question, and I'm just trying to picture how this would actually work. And I think you raised the question about telehealth, and I know in the question earlier, Mr. Blakey, so is there going to be required to be a difference in billing rates for different numbers? And I think you're referencing that this would be handled probably like telehealth, where we're going to only pay 50%, or we're going to pay a lower rate. But to that point, then, if that's the case, I'm just looking out in rural Nebraska, and I'm looking at how many rural Nebraska hospitals were profitable last year. And I look at what's going ahead with where things are being proposed for Medicaid reimbursement rates. I'm very concerned about how many of those are going to continue to be viable, how many clinics are going to be viable. Look at the number of physicians who have wanted to sell their practices to the hospital because they can't make it work anymore. And so I'm trying to figure out, if you absorb those and then you're going to have a lower reimbursement rate, what would be the motivation for the hospital to buy those clinics?
I don't see one, Senator, other than to provide care. I think we all know that preventative care is a big component to your future health, and that's where these clinics do a lot of their good work.
So to be clear then, I guess what I'm looking at is, if you're in a hospital, let me just pick a hospital in my district, Grant. Actually, technically, I think it's just outside of my footprint, but I'm going to use it. So they work with North Platte back and forth. Let's just say that they decided that they wanted North Platte to absorb that hospital. Then they could potentially be looking at a different reimbursement rate there if it was absorbed into GPH. So then at what point would GPH say, if you're only going to reimburse 75% of our rates, then would they just say, I'm not going to buy it, your people are going to just have to travel further to get there? Is that not the logical outcome?
We've seen that here locally and nationally when hospitals do close. The last closure we had was in 2021 in Oakland. They kept a clinic there to at least serve that population with some sort of health care. But to your point, if it's not financially viable, like you said, our hospitals aren't, rich with cash right now. And so when you make those determinations business-wise, in your profession outside of this, it wouldn't make good sense. If I came in and asked you to loan me money to take on a clinic that's going to be reimbursed at a different rate than at the hospital, regardless of the care. Again, it goes back to my telehealth point. We're providing great care to that patient, regardless of where it is. But the insurance companies are now mandating and dictating the reimbursement of that rate, regardless of the care that it's received, regardless of the provider. It's the same path they're going down with the clinics.
Well, being the committee member who wants to bring everyone together, I would just say that the other thing I've watched as a hospital board member is the fact that the biggest problem and the biggest elephant in the room is the fact that Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement rates are horrible. And as a result of that, costs are having to go up. And so those that are truly private pay and can afford to pay privately, or Blue Cross Blue Shield in most cases, has to pick up the difference. And that's really the push-pull that's going on. And a lot of this could probably be solved if we had decent reimbursement rates coming from Medicaid and from Medicare. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that 100%, and that's why we've asked the legislature this year for an increase in Medicaid, and without that, it's just not sustainable. You're absolutely right.
Mr. Bell and Mr. Blakey are great guys, and they represent great organizations. But at the end of the day, that's the problem that we're dealing with, is how can we keep rural hospitals in particular viable? And metro hospitals aren't exempt from that. And ultimately, we've got to deal with regulation, and we've got to deal with reimbursement rates, or these costs aren't going to get under control.
I would agree
Thank
100% with that.
Thank you, Senator Jacobson. Additional committee questions? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Hale.
Thank you, Senator Slama.
All right. Additional opposition testimony to LB 640? Seeing none, any neutral testimony for LB 640? Seeing none, Senator Kauth, you're welcome to close. As you approach, we have one opponent letter for the record.
Thank you very much, Chair. Listening to some of the testimony from the opponent, we went online and Googled how do you get an NPI number, and you submit it to CMS. If you do it electronically, it takes 10 days. By paper, it takes 20 days. So I don't think that the burdensomeness of getting an NPI number is truly an accurate representation. I think understanding where service is being held is really important for us to be able to start tailoring those conversations about how much are we actually charging. Those are two separate things. So I don't want us combining those in this discussion. This is just truly to say, where are people getting their services? Because then we can start analyzing that data. Without that data, all we're looking at is, well, Methodist or CHI or UNMC is everywhere and they're doing all of this stuff. We don't have accurate information. And to the point that, does it provide a disincentive for these large organizations to go in and buy small community clinics? I would say that it provides a perverse incentive for them to go in and purchase them. Because if they can look at that as an extension of getting a lot more money for those rates, we're going to have small community clinics being closed or absorbed by these large monoliths. So I think that cuts both ways. I would really like us to focus on just a transparency issue of where exactly is service being provided and save the other issues for another time. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kauth. Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much. This brings to a close our hearing on LB 640 and a close for all of our hearings for the day. Committee members, can you just stick around briefly? I want to give an update.